Great. Let's begin. So we're reaching the end of the retreat. Doesn't need to be the end of practice. I hope it's the beginning of a very rewarding practice for you. So I want to spend some time today talking more about how to apply the things we've learned this week into actually making a difference in life. Right from the beginning, I have been talking about how we don't want meditation to be something that is limited to a room where you go sit, take an hour's break from the world and feel a little better at the end of it. And then you go back to the world and everything is just the same. We want to go beyond that. And already in the interviews, I've been talking to all of you and very happy to share that consistently I have been hearing about how people are actually finding a difference in their day-to-day life as well, how they're interacting with people differently, situations differently, how they're more alert to what's happening in their mind. So today's focuses on just understanding how we bring this into life, and also they'll be sharing a framework that you can use to look at the tougher situations, right? So we all have our rabbit holes, our personal areas that we get stuck, where we get caught, where we don't know what to do, where we seem to come up to a dead end in terms of what we can do every time. So how can we use the framework to start changing the way the situation normally flows? Okay. So before we do that, I will share a small video, and the idea of this video is to just you may have seen this before, but I'm sure it will seem a little different from the context of what we've been discussing and practicing and seeing in our practice the last week. Right? And this video is about habitual patterns and about breaking habitual patterns. Okay. So let me just share my screen and put that. So I'll just start the video. I'll just pause for a minute so you can confirm whether it is the audio is audible as well.
Okay. Hey, it's me, Destin. Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like...
Is the audio audible?
Yes, it is.
Cool.
Riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you...
Cool. So we'll begin. Just let the video play. Again, like I said, it might be something you've seen before, but do pay attention and try to see it from the context of what you've been experiencing and what we've been discussing over the last week.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? But I did something. I did something that damaged my mind. It happened on the streets of Amsterdam, and I got really scared, honestly. I can't ride a bike like you can anymore. Before I show you the video of what happened, I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver mullet, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill, and I was really proud of it. Everything changed, though, when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses, and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle, and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike, ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
All right. So the faster I go, the better.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Destin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downwards force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels. Every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. You might think you can, but you can't. I know this because I'm often asked to speak at universities and conferences, and I take the bike with me. It's always the same. People think they're going to try some trick or they're just going to power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle this. For instance, this guy, I offered him $200 just to ride this bike 10 feet across the stage. Everybody thought he could do it.
No, you didn't understand. You didn't understand it. So, this way. All right, so, whenever you're ready. Quick. No, you have to keep your feet on. All right, let you guys start rolling at least. And go. Oh, God! All right, back up. Okay. Keep your feet on the pedal. Go. Just keep your feet on the pedals. Yeah, come on. One more time.
Once you have a rigid way of thinking in your head, sometimes you cannot change that, even if you want to. Here's what I did. It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck, but at least I could ride it. My son is the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. That's over half his life. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut.
Are you going to give up?
No.
Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up. You got it. Did you see his brain get it? So in how many weeks have we been doing this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do, which demonstrates that a child has more neuroplasticity, am I even saying that right, than an adult.
It's clear from this experiment that children have a much more plastic brain than adults. That's why the best time to learn a language is when you're a young child.
All right, today's bike log. I can ride smooth, I can ride fast. I'm thinking the experiment is over. Okay, now I'm in Amsterdam, a city that has more bicycles than people. The question is, can I ride a normal bike now? I mean, I've spent all this time unlearning how to ride a bike. If I go back and try to ride a normal one, will my brain mess up? So I've tweeted a Smarter Everyday meetup, if you will, and I'm going to see if somebody brings a bicycle, and I'm going to try to ride a normal bike.
It's backwards. This was one of the most frustrating moments of my life. I had ridden a normal bike since I was 6, but in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I had set out to prove that I could free my brain from a cognitive bias. But at this point, I'm pretty sure that all I proved is that I can only redesignate that bias.
So what you're not seeing is just a group of people here looking at me, looking at the strange American. I can't ride a bike because they think I'm dumb. But I'm actually 2 levels deep into this because I've learned and unlearned. All right.
After 20 minutes of making a fool out of myself, suddenly my brain clicked back into the old algorithm. I can't explain it, but it happened in a very specific moment.
Got it. I'm back. Oh, click. Hold it, click. I got it. Okay, there it is. There was the moment. Okay, I can ride a bike.
I tried to explain this to the people around me, and they just didn't get it. They thought I was faking the previous 20 minutes, and I couldn't get anybody to believe me.
That looked like I faked that, didn't it?
Yeah.
Just a
Yeah.
fake. You think I'm faking? You don't prove.
This is so weird. You're like, la, la, and it's cool.
You think I'm lying, don't you?
Yeah.
I'm not lying.
I felt like the only person on the planet who had ever unlearned how to ride a bike, and I couldn't articulate it to anyone because everybody just knew that you can't forget how to ride a bike. So I learned 3 things from this experiment. I learned that welders are often smarter than engineers. I learned that knowledge does not equal understanding. And I learned that truth is truth, no matter what I think about it. So be very careful how you interpret things because you're looking at the world with a bias, whether you think you are or not. I'm Destin. I'm getting smarter every day. Have a good night.
Okay, if you want to support Smarter Every Day,
Okay, so that's what we are faced with. I just put on my headphones. I want the audio to be audible. Okay. Very entertaining video. I find it remarkable every time I see it. So a couple of things, right? So I think one great thing that Destin called out was that knowledge is not equal to understanding. So all of us have heard TED Talks, inspirational talks, and most often we find that while we feel very inspired, very motivated in the moment, nothing changes in our life. And maybe a few days later, even the basic concept, maybe we try out something the day after we hear that. And in a few days, we've forgotten what we learned and what we even heard. So knowledge is not equal to understanding, and understanding comes with practice. The other important thing that he called out is one thing is that our brains are in ruts. Like we have extremely strong habitual patterns. Whenever something happens, we have an extremely set and biased way of looking at things, right? There's a statement he makes right at the end: the truth is the truth, right? So there is something that happens in reality, and there is a story that we attach to it. We go from this happened to why did this happen to me, or why is this happening to me? I like it, I don't like it. Why doesn't something else happen that I want? And finally, the other thing that obviously the central theme is the theme of neuroplasticity. So even though we can't determine whether we can't decide to have the plasticity of a young child, but the moment we start learning something useful, we can start reshaping our mind so that our habitual patterns that we've had in the past change to things that we are now practicing, things that are more wholesome, things that are more beneficial to us. So I'm sure everyone on their first day found the 6 hours difficult, hard to remember, and not sure if you're doing it right or not. Not like learning to ride a bike reverse or normal, right? And in a few days, you start to get more and more natural with it. Many of you are already in a place where you start to notice the craving build up in everyday situation, right? And soon, hopefully, that will become a habit. Being able to understand the craving, being able to reduce that craving with the harmonious practice of 6 hours. So that is what we are looking at. We are looking at changing the conditioning. We also talked about the underlying conditioning, the foundation of the system, the current foundation of the system, and how we can modify it. So every time we're teaching the mind a new habit, we are slowly starting to change our habitual patterns from things that are unwholesome, things that lead us to suffering, to things that don't lead to suffering, things that lead to joy. Great. So with that as the base, I'll just try to use the understanding of dependent origination, what we've discussed, and how we can look at different aspects of that, how we can use that to analyze different situations. So specifically, how we can use it to understand rabbit holes that our mind goes into, things that really bother us, things that we cannot reconcile with. Okay, so just give me a moment. Conveniently for me, I am able to recycle a lot of the format we used earlier, and hopefully it's useful for you as well in terms of being able to relate to the things that we've been discussing so far. Okay. So in terms of daily life, the Buddha talks about three pillars: dana, shila, and bhavana. In terms of retraining the mind, in terms of creating wholesome patterns, wholesome conditioning in the mind. So the first is dana or generosity. Dan can be thought of the ability to give something without expecting any returns on it, giving it purely as a act of generosity, as an act of goodwill. The way you've been sending metta to your spiritual friend or to other people or to other beings, right? That is something we've been practicing. Generosity doesn't necessarily need to be in terms of a physical action, in terms of speech, in terms of money or material things. It can start with something as simple as a smile. It can start with something as simple as having a mind based in the Brahma Vihara, sending loving kindness, metta, or compassion, karuna, joy or mudita, and finally upekha or equanimity to people around us. Shila is the precepts that we take every morning. It is the conducive behavior for development of the mind, and shield needs to be always thought of as something like an umbrella, something of a protection that we have. It is not, nobody is keeping a moral account book, moral balance sheet. Something that you did is a sin, something that you did is not a sin, right? So it is not about sinning, it is not about going down or up in a particular ledger. It is about behavior that is conducive for development of your mind. So if you look at all of the precepts, right? If you look at the precepts, taking what is not given, intentionally harming or killing other living beings, sexual misconduct, indulging in harsh speech, gossip, slander, lies. These are typically actions that emerge when we get completely engaged, completely caught up with craving in a moment. We want something so bad that we are willing to hurt someone. We want something so bad that we are willing to lie about it, or we want something so bad that we are willing to engineer discord between people, slander someone, gossip someone. So we may not be able to actually intellectualize this whole thing, but that is the mechanism that is working within us. So these, every time you break a precept, you send an exceptionally strong message to your mind that it is okay to allow craving to grow out of proportions, out of control, and to act based on that, even to the extent of creating suffering for oneself or to another. Every time you do this, you create suffering for yourself or for another being, right? Killing or harming someone, taking what is not given, you're depriving someone else of something, telling lies, harsh speech, gossip, and slander. You're hurting yourself as well as someone else. There is no such thing as a victimless crime, right? So when you break your shield, you're either, if you're not, even if you're not affecting anybody else, you are affecting yourself. You are causing yourself to learn that if the craving is really strong, then we can do anything that we want. We can justify what is happening. Lying in particular is very interesting because what happens is when we lie, we start to fracture our mind. We start to create parallel versions of the world of reality. So depending on whom we have lied to, what we have lied about, we know one reality for ourselves, we concoct another reality for another person, and so on. Right? That is the reason lying is specifically called out by the Buddha also when he teaches his son Rahula. And the third part is cultivation of mind, bhavana. This is sitting and active meditation. This is also developing one's understanding by listening to talks or reading the suttas, understanding, reading more different parts of the suttas, different threads fall into place, activate different parts of your mind, and you're sitting and active meditation that allows you to develop collectedness, develop mindfulness, develop the harmonious practice, allows you to be more alert to what is actually happening in your mind and choose a more wholesome course of action. So these three are supporting foundations for your day to day as well, right? And now let's come to, with the support of these foundations, these pillars, how do we actually look at specific situations where we seem to be hitting a dead end, where we seem to find no resolution. So we'll use the same concept of dependent origination to see what are the different links, how we are proceeding through this habitual pattern, and how do we start to break the cycle, right? Start behaving in a different way, start learning to ride the inverted cycle. You have your current foundation. So the first few links that we discussed the other day, you have ignorance, you have conditioning, you have consciousness, you have mentality, materiality, and you have your sense basis, right? So these are already a system that is in place. You cannot go to the past and change your conditioning, go to the past, change your physicality, change your sense basis. You are starting with this right now. So there is not much to be done here. We did talk about craving being the most active part that we can actually work with, but we can also start a couple of steps before that. Craving is the thing that we need to root out. But when we start looking at different situations and start creating a framework for analysis, right? So we can actually start the actions a little before. In a particular moment, you can only work with craving, but when we are trying to resolve a longer standing situation, we can start with contact. So how do we look at contact? So if we look at a situation, right? So for example, we have somebody very disagreeable in our environment, or we have some kind of an addiction, right? Or we have some kind of aversion to something that happens. So can you modify the environment to reduce unwholesome contact? Contact that typically precipitates an unwholesome chain of habitual patterns. So one, can we modify the environment? So can we, for example, we talked about the way, very rudimentary way in which sometimes harmonious lifestyle or ajivika is defined. And we talked about how we can potentially see if workplace requires us to be deceitful to customers, clients, vendors, partners, whoever. Does it make sense to actually consider moving out of that environment, right? If you have if you're living with somebody that is extremely abusive, does it make sense to move out of that environment? It is not the only option. If that becomes the only option, you might end up with the only solution being to renounce the world and become a monk. But that doesn't need to be the only solution to modifying your environment. If it is an addiction, does something that trigger your addiction, is it around you? So there are different cues that trigger habitual patterns within us. So if it is cigarettes, do you have a pack of cigarettes lying around? If it is a craving for sweets, do you have sweets, a fridge stocked with sweets? If it is a craving to certain smartphone apps or certain type of content, is it that your phone or your television or your Chromecast are already loaded with all the things, and it is every moment is a struggle to overcome the temptation to give into that, right? If it is an aversion, is it possible to avoid, if you take a certain route and you, while maybe walking your dog, and you have a neighbor who's always frustrated to see that and shouts out, is it possible without uh, too much distress to actually modify the environment? Can you take a different route? Can you change what you stock in your house, in your smartphone, in your television, right? Can you choose to be with someone or not? So, for example, there was a question a couple of days around back around people that you know, and they may have unwholesome tendencies, right? So, people around you who have a tendency to speak ill of other people. So, does it make sense to avoid that company? So, those are things to be looked at. And this is not a straightforward thing. You may not, there may be some things you can simply eliminate from your environment or modify your environment. There'll be things that are easier to do, and there'll be things that are harder to do. So, you have to price in the cost of not having to go down those habitual patterns, the difficulty of breaking those habitual patterns, and the feasibility of actually changing your environment. Is it possible to do that at all? And there will be times, for example, there is no possibility to change that environment. So, you, for example, a child in an abusive home may not really have the agency or the opportunity to change their environment. Or if you are on a visa in a different country and you're required to be in that job, and it is not possible to completely disrupt, you are, if you're going to unbox an entire set of scenarios that will create more suffering. So those are things that you need to consider. So the first thing to see is, for any situation, is there something we can do in terms of modifying the environment so that we don't have the contact? So we have to trace, right? So anything that happens, right? So whether it is sitting and worrying about one's future, one's financial stability, or if it is frustration about something that you or your partner does, or if it is about a friend who behaves in a certain way, if it is about a workplace issue, if it is about an addiction, right? So you have to trace the entire path of dependent origination. What is the contact that is happening? What is the feeling that arises? What is the craving? What is the clinging that is happening? What is the habitual tendency? What is the compulsive action that we do, and what are the consequences? So we'll go through that entire process to understand what's happening and to ask the questions that can help us lead to different outcomes. The second thing that happens after the contact, feeling comes up naturally. So it is possible in a given situation, you're able to modify the environment to reduce the unwholesome contact. If you're not able to do it, what you can do is you can observe the feeling, right? So immediately, do you feel an irritation? Do you feel a physical discomfort? Do you immediately go, right, on something happening? So that is telling you that you already have a foundation of painful or pleasant feeling on which the rest of the behavior is going to be predicated. It is just about understanding. It also tells you how attached you are to it, right? So the feeling that you get, depending on how painful it is, right? If I remember in college, there used to be days when certain foods would be made in a mess, and people would start getting depressed the previous day, anticipating what was to come, right? So the degree of attachment is related to how painful or pleasant the Vedana or the feeling associated. Now, in a situation, like I said, we can start working directly with craving because we were not able to change anything. When you're already in a situation, you can't go about modifying the environment. You can't go about modifying the feeling at that point. You can't modify the feeling anyway. That will happen over a course of time. When craving arises, the simple thing is simply to use the 6 R's with the help of mindfulness. And part of building this mindfulness is actually tracing this process for those situations, understanding what the process is, anticipating, right? So anticipating the contacts that will happen. You know, certain people will come, they will say something that will set you off, right? So you're able to anticipate that this is going to happen, anticipate that craving will come up, and this helps you to be more mindful, more alert to use the 6 hours. Because if craving is there, no matter how much you have planned, you are going to go down that same path. So without diffusing craving, none of the behavior modification is going to happen, no matter how well you understand it. So this is related to knowledge not being equal to understanding. Once you diffuse the craving, right? Once you step out of that craving, you are able to actually change the course of action. So this is where true volition comes in. So we all have a sense of being free agents, free will. I did this because I wanted to. But what is typically happening is we are just responding to the environment, acting out a certain set of habitual patterns. There will be a certain probability of what actions you do, depending on the situation, depending what you have experienced right before, depending on your mood at that time. So there are those things that will affect the specific thing that you do. But most of the time, we are just acting out compulsive patterns in reaction to whatever is happening around us. True volition comes when we diffuse the craving. We say we're not just going down the habitual pattern, let us break the cycle. Right? So we need to remember to do that. Anticipating the event, anticipating the contacts that can happen helps us with that. We are not always able to anticipate that contact. You cannot anticipate when somebody is going to cut you off on the road, right? And that is where the bhavana, the practice of meditation regularly helps your mind to become sensitive to that tightening sensation. Now, what happens when craving comes in, right? Craving is the precursor to clinging. Craving is the beginning of personalizing. I like it, I don't like it. It starts creating an identification with the situation, and clinging starts to flesh out that identity. Your identity is, I don't like this. For instance, I don't like this because this undermines me in front of my team or in front of my friends or in front of my family. I don't like this because people are going to judge me, right? So I tripped and fell, or I left my fly open, and I suddenly realized it, right? So I start creating a story, and the more typically the I that we create that is based on craving is something that is very tiny, very small, very powerless and helpless against the environment, right? So when there is craving, you want things to be different from what they are. And unfortunately, you have now collapsed into this identity. You are not able to take a step away. When you relax and let the craving go, you are able to take a step away. You are able to say that this happened. What can I do that is wholesome? When you don't relax the craving, you go further, you collapse into that identity that is typically powerless, helpless, frustrated with what's happening, irritated, angry with what's happening, with the fact that the world is not exactly as you want it, with the fact that the entire world, with so many people living out their compulsions, is not cooperating to create the perfect moment for you. When I say it like that, it might sound ridiculous, but literally that becomes the mentality when we give in to craving and we become that identity there. Clinging brings up the story of that situation, clinging and habitual patterns. So what do we need to investigate? So when we look at a certain pattern, right, when we went down the rabbit hole, we need to reflect on how did we go about it, right? How did I interpret this situation? How did that make me feel? Did it make me feel agitated? Did it make me feel angry? Did it make me feel sad? Did it make me feel powerless? Did it make me feel incapable? How do I identify? How and see whether that identity is something that is actually powerful and capable, or powerless and incapable? Is it restricted? Is it diminished by the circumstance? And the next question is to start thinking about how can you actually change things about that situation. One more thing that I missed is how do I think about other people in this situation? So what also happens is when we do this identification, when we personalize things for ourselves, when we become this small person who's fighting to create the world that they want versus the signals from reality that are coming, saying that the world is not what you want, right? We also think about other people who have absolutely no agenda but to, not cooperate with us. So people who are not cooperating with us, we start, when we get irritated about the situation, we see them as enemies. We see that we don't understand that they are acting out their compulsions. We feel that this is completely directed. This is a person who is in complete control of their senses. They have no craving. They have given up craving. They are not going through a compulsive pattern, but they have a specific agenda where their world suddenly looks better because they are harming or hurting you. Right? So this is the mistake that we make about the agency of people, the free will of people, the intentions of people. So we are always interpreting something, and every person is interpreting the situation as a protagonist of their story. They are a trapped hero or heroine that is trying to make their way in the world, and in an uncooperative world, trying to fight obstacle after obstacle. And yes, sometimes I may make mistakes, but that is unfortunately what the situation compelled me to do. So the same kind of things that you do when you break your precepts, when you do something unwholesome, just justify your action that I had no other option. I was simply reacting to the situation, or this is the most obvious thing to do. So this is the same kind of thought process that is going on in another person's mind. So how do I think about other people? Do I think that they are extreme people who are extremely in control of what they are? They like an evil mastermind who has an agenda to undermine you, to hurt you, right? How do I look at other people? And finally, how can I interpret this differently? So this different interpretation, why is this useful? It's useful because when you diffuse the craving, right? So you need some cues. There is action required, right? You cannot simply, unlike your meditation, you can't simply always diffuse the craving and go back to sending metta. You can do that, but most probably when you're dealing with other people, you will need to actually take some action. When you're dealing with yourself, you may actually go back to metta, but again, you may be in the middle of some task. You may need to get to some task, or you may need to take some action. So what is useful is to analyze these, because these are strong. When we are talking about rabbit holes, these are extremely strong patterns that we have. These are things that repeat enough for us to be able to identify that this is something, and they create enough suffering for us to be able to see that this is something that creates suffering for me. So a very useful question, and all of this is quite useful when you actually write it down, because when things are in the mind, they can be very vague. They can be subject to being inconsistent, right? So you can end up saying things, making up stories that are consistent or inconsistent. So write it down, poke holes in that, right? So there are two types of argument out of many argument types, right? There are two arguments. One is a straw man argument, right? Where you create something else that is easy to attack, and you attack that, right? So you shift the story. You don't stay on point. You don't actually confront the interpretation that you have, but you say, what about this thing that the other person did, right? And there is another part which is called the steel man, where you absolutely strengthen the other person's argument. You say everything that is there to be said in terms of the other person, and you try to see now how can this situation be interpreted differently. So look at the argument, look at the interpretation of the situation, try to figure out what's happening, and try to poke holes in that and see how you can interpret this differently. When you make that argument, also try to poke holes in it. Is it possible for me to actually think this way, or is it going to be difficult? So understanding, tracing the habitual patterns, tracing the world making that we did. Clinging is how we thought of ourselves, the identity we gave ourselves, how we thought of the situation, how we thought of other people, right? And this could be any kind of situation. It could be just yourself thinking about how you are performing in life, or how are you performing in relationship, or it can be about what other people did when interacting with you. And finally, actions, right? So actions is important because you can have a variety of interpretations, but you may not have a lot of actions. The same thing, right? It's useful to think about a set of actions that can be performed, because in that moment, after you diffuse your craving, you will be dealing with a new situation, you will be dealing with a new problem. So you may not always have a ready action that you can immediately perform. What are the things we can do differently, and how can they be, more importantly, what is useful to ask is how can they be grounded in the Brahma Viharas? How can I act out of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity in this situation? The same question of the Brahma Viharas can also be asked about the interpretation of the system. How can I interpret this situation if I was placed in the Brahma Viharas? Now, what this does is, as soon as you ask the questions in that way, right, my interpretation of the situation, the actions that are available to me, when you ground it in loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, what you do is immediately you ascribe a very large, powerful, and capable identity to yourself. Like I mentioned, you can start with the Brahma Viharas just by having a smile in your mind, an intention in your mind, right? You know that you have this identity or this self-image that you create is already empowered, because no matter what the external situation, you have the agency to make a positive change in the world, right? So that is the absolute minimum. The least you can do is smile at that situation. The least you can do is be equanimous about that situation. The least you can do is bring compassion or joy into that situation, right? So starting to base our interpretation and potential actions in the Brahma Viharas completely changes, right? So instead of why is this person behaving like this with me, the question that you might ask yourself and the action that you might do is, okay, this person is clearly compulsive and suffering. What can I do to relieve their suffering while taking this situation forward? This may sound extremely difficult to do, extremely idealistic, but it is just the question of the backward bicycle, right? So you need to practice this. You need to practice this actively. You need to continue your cultivation of mind, continue to keep the precepts, continue to build generosity, right? So as you do that, you will find it easier and easier to do this naturally till that one day where the mind just knows, right, for a particular situation. And some situations will be easy, very easy to give up, very easy to change, very easy to modify. Some will be harder. And that is directly a reflection of the degree of attachment that we have. And the final thing, Jarana Maran, or the consequences of the action, right? So what we also need to do is, so far it seems like we are just simply trying to put the entire onus on us thinking of the situation badly. But there is actually a price that we pay for not thinking that way, right? We need to see the consequences of actions that were done on the basis of craving. How did it create suffering for myself or for others? Did it make me feel dissatisfied? Did it make me feel unfulfilled? Did it make me feel diminished? Did it make me feel angry? Did it make me feel frustrated? Did it make me feel betrayed? Right? So whatever action I did, whatever way I interpreted it, right? How do the consequences? So the consequences are not just in the moment. You might say something back to another person. It might escalate. It might not escalate. It might lead to resentment on both sides. It may reflect in the next set of actions, next set of interactions between two people, and so on, right? Or if you spend time self-flagellating, right? Thinking about the decisions you have done in the past, things you have done in the past, self-flagellating. How does that make you feel? How does that leave you feeling for the rest of the day? How does that affect in your behavior towards other people? The world, your actions are always a reflection of your state of mind. So how does one action based in craving lead to consequences for future actions, future states of mind? And how does it affect me as well as others? So that is something very important, because it is not just about doing something wholesome for the sake of it, right? So it's not for saying that, okay, I'm doing something wholesome now. What we can have there is a common phrase called enlightened self-interest, but most of the time it is just about giving into craving, right? And getting the most out of a situation for yourself, but grabbing more out of a situation. That is how the world tends to interpret and use this phrase in action. If you look at the people who have talked about it and the actions that they have done. But in this case, enlightened self-interest actually understanding what are the consequences of those actions and what can be the consequences of different actions. Specifically, what can be the consequences of actions based in Brahma Viharas. Visualize this and try it out in practice and see, does that make you feel differently? Again, none of this needs to be theoretical. None of this needs to be believed. None of this needs to be taken at face value. My very earnest request to everybody is to take something that bothers you, take something that you clearly identify as a source of dissatisfaction or suffering in your life, and use this framework. Use the entire understanding of dependent origination to design different sets of actions. Use the 6 hours to diffuse the craving. Be prepared to be mindful, right? Anticipate what's going to happen, be prepared, anticipate what's going to happen, be prepared in terms of alternatives of how you can interpret the situation. What can your self-image be? Is it somebody who's stuck in a large uncooperative world and powerless and frustrated in being able to change it? Or is it somebody who is in a world where they can actually make a positive change no matter what the world is, what the restrictions, what the constraints are? So see how it works. Try out this exercise. And what I'd really like is tomorrow we can, I'd like if you can just give it a shot and share it with me during our check-ins, right? So if you can take up one situation and just go through that, you can either drop me a message of how you thought about it or discuss it with me during the check-in. Right? So I think that will be interesting to see. And I can say from personal experience, there are a lot of situations where I have applied this framework and it has worked for me. I have shared this framework with people and it has worked very well for them. I would request you to give it a shot, try it and see the consequence, right? See the consequences of those actions, see the mind states that result. The North Star always should be a wholesome, elevated, uplifted mind state and actions that are skillful, actions that do not create suffering for oneself and for others. Everything else is subservient to that. If you can keep your mind in the Brahma Viharas, if you can keep your mind in an uplifted state, that will reflect in the impact that you have on people around you. And you can decide if that is something that sounds attractive to work towards. Great. So that's what I wanted to share in terms of a framework. We'll be sharing this on the WhatsApp as well. Thoughts, questions, comments? You can also comment on the video earlier. Great. I think what is more important than asking me anything or is to actually try this out for yourself. So I'd be very happy if those of you can spend some time looking through this, share this with me, take a problem and share it with me during the check-in, how you applied it. It'll be useful to see. I might learn something and it might be interesting to discuss as well. Okay, let's share some merit and that'll be it for today. Tomorrow will be the last session. Okay, so we will continue with a few points about taking this into daily life, and we'll also talk about the support that will be available to you after the retreat, future retreats that are coming up, and yeah, so some of that information will be shared, and shorter session tomorrow.
And I look forward to hearing from you during the check-in. Let's share some merit. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear struck fearlessly. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May enlightened beings of mighty power share in this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.